It was a warm afternoon in a quiet southern town, the kind of day when the sun felt heavy and the roads shimmered with heat. Cars passed lazily down the long stretch of highway, the sound of tires mixing with the low hum of cicadas in the distance. On that road drove an elderly woman named Lena, her small blue sedan moving at a steady pace. She wore a simple floral dress, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a soft scarf. On the passenger seat rested a folded American flag and a small bunch of wildflowers wrapped in paper. She had just come from the cemetery where her husband Daniel was buried. Every year on the same day, she made the drive to bring him flowers and spend a few quiet minutes talking to him like she always had when he was alive. The drive home was usually peaceful, but today something felt different. Lena had noticed a police car following her for a few minutes now. She checked her rearview mirror trying to keep calm, but when the red and blue lights flashed behind her, her stomach sank. She slowly pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down her window as the officer approached. The man who stepped out of the car was tall and broad-shouldered, his sunglasses hiding any sign of warmth. His name was Officer Bradley, and he had a reputation in the area for being harsh, especially toward people who didn't look like him. He stopped beside her window, hand resting on his belt, and leaned slightly forward. "License and registration," he said, his tone sharp and impatient. Lena nodded and reached for her purse. Her hands trembled a little as she pulled out the papers. She handed them over without saying much, trying to stay calm. Bradley glanced at her, then at her car, his eyes narrowing as if he was already sure she'd done something wrong. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked. Lena shook her head. "No, officer, I don't believe I was speeding." He smirked slightly. "You crossed the line a bit back there. Could be reckless driving." Lena frowned softly, her voice calm. "I'm sorry, sir. I must have drifted a little. My eyesight isn't as sharp as it used to be." Bradley didn't seem to care. He looked around her car, his eyes pausing on the folded flag on the seat. "What's that for?" he asked. Lena's face softened. "That flag belonged to my husband. He served in the military for 30 years. Passed away 5 years ago." Bradley's expression didn't change. He rolled his eyes slightly, muttering under his breath. "Uh-huh. Sure. You got any weapons or illegal substances in this vehicle?" Her heart dropped. "No, sir." "Of course not. Mind if I take a look?" Lena hesitated. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." "That's not what I asked," he interrupted. His tone grew colder. "Step out of the car, ma'am." She sighed and unbuckled her seatbelt. Her legs felt weak as she stepped out. The gravel crunched under her shoes. Bradley opened her back door and began checking her seats, the glove box, and even her small handbag. His movements were rough, careless. Lena stood by quietly, clutching her hands together, trying not to let her frustration show. He didn't find anything. Still, he looked unsatisfied. He glanced again at the flag, then at the framed photo sitting beside it. He picked it up and studied it. It showed Lena standing beside her husband, both smiling proudly in front of a military base. Her husband wore a clean, pressed uniform with medals pinned neatly on his chest. His name tag read Major Daniel Cooper. Bradley stared at it for a few seconds. Something about that name stirred something in the back of his mind, but he couldn't quite place it. He frowned and put the picture back on the seat. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Home, officer. I live just outside town." "What were you doing out here?" "Visiting my husband," she said softly. "Today's the anniversary of his passing." Bradley didn't respond right away. He stood there for a moment, watching her. He wanted to say something rude, something to reassert control. But the quiet strength in her eyes stopped him for a second. She didn't look angry. She looked tired in a way that spoke of years of endurance. He cleared his throat and said, "All right, you can go. But next time, keep it steady on the road." He scribbled a quick ticket on his notepad and handed it to her. Lena took it without a word, folded it neatly, and got back in her car. As she drove away, Bradley stood by his cruiser, watching the car disappear down the long stretch of highway. For some reason, he couldn't stop thinking about that photo. The man in the picture, the uniform, the name, it all seemed familiar. He didn't like that feeling. It made him uncomfortable, so he shook it off and went back to his patrol routine. But even as the day went on, his mind kept returning to that name, Major Daniel Cooper. That evening, when his shift ended, Bradley sat in the small break room at the police station. The place was quiet except for the buzz of the vending machine. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down, staring at the steam rising from the cup. The name kept echoing in his mind. He pulled out his phone and searched Major Daniel Cooper. The first result that popped up was an old military article. He tapped on it and the screen filled with a photo of the same man he had seen earlier, Lena's husband. Major Cooper was described as a decorated war hero. The article talked about how he had led a unit of soldiers through dangerous missions overseas. He had saved several of his men during an ambush by putting himself in harm's way. Bradley scrolled further and froze when he read one particular detail. Among the soldiers saved that day was Sergeant David Hayes, his father. Bradley blinked. His heart pounded as he read the line again. His father had mentioned that story years ago when Bradley was a teenager. He used to talk about a brave commanding officer who risked his life to pull injured men out of a burning vehicle. His father had said that if it weren't for that man, he wouldn't have made it home. And now Bradley realized that the man his father owed his life to was the same man whose widow he had humiliated earlier that day. He sat back, his chest tightening with guilt. He thought about how he'd spoken to her, the cold tone, the suspicion, the arrogance. She hadn't even argued with him. She had just stood there quietly, letting him search her car like she was some criminal. Bradley rubbed his forehead, feeling sick to his stomach. He had spent years thinking he was enforcing the law, but in that moment he saw the truth. He wasn't enforcing justice, he was feeding his own prejudice, one stop at a time. He closed his eyes and saw her again, the calm in her face, the sadness in her eyes, the flag folded neatly on the seat beside her. She hadn't said much, but every word she spoke carried dignity. Bradley stayed in the station long after everyone else had gone home. The coffee had gone cold, but he didn't care. He opened the article again and stared at the photo of Major Cooper, the man who had risked everything for soldiers who didn't even look like him. For the first time in years, Bradley felt ashamed of the badge on his chest. That night, when he finally drove home, the roads were dark and empty. He passed the same stretch of highway where he had pulled Lena over. The flashing lights and harsh words replayed in his mind like a bad dream. He slowed down as he reached the spot. For a moment, he considered turning around and driving to her house, but he didn't even know where she lived. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, whispering to himself, "What have I done?" The next morning, he woke up early, unable to rest. The guilt hadn't gone away. He got dressed in plain clothes, not his uniform, and drove to the address listed on the ticket he'd written. It was a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by tall oak trees and a white picket fence that had seen better days. He parked out front and sat in his car for a long time, just staring at the door. He didn't know what he was going to say or how she'd react if she even opened the door, but deep down he knew he had to do something. As he finally stepped out and walked up to the porch, he could hear birds chirping and the faint sound of a radio playing gospel music from inside. His heart raced. He lifted his hand and knocked gently on the door. After a moment, Lena opened it. She looked surprised to see him there, her eyes wary but calm. Bradley took a slow breath and said quietly, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." Lena looked at him for a long moment, saying nothing. The morning sun touched her face, highlighting the lines that carried years of strength and grace. She didn't say a word, but something in her gaze told him that she was listening, and that's where everything began to change. Lena stood quietly, listening to the officer's apology. She didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. There was a calm in her eyes, something steady and quiet that spoke louder than words. Bradley shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure how to continue. He hated how small he felt standing there, realizing that the person he had judged so harshly was far stronger than he had ever been. I realized something last night," he finally said, his voice low. "I searched your husband's name. I found out who he was. He saved people. He saved my father. I treated you terribly, and I'm so sorry." Lena's lips pressed together for a moment. Then she nodded slightly. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just gave him a look that told him she was listening, that she understood he was speaking from the heart. Bradley swallowed hard. "I don't know if you'll forgive me. I needed you to know that I'm sorry." Lena nodded again, and for a second the weight of years and pain and prejudice hung between them. She gestured to a chair on the porch. "Please sit," she said softly. Bradley hesitated but then sat down, unsure if he deserved the small act of kindness. Lena went back inside and returned with 2 cups of tea, carefully placing one in front of him. He took it with both hands, the warmth of the cup grounding him. She sat across from him, her eyes calm. He noticed her hands were lined with age, the fingers slightly bent from years of work and life's hardships. Yet there was a strength in them, the hands of someone who had faced loss and sorrow but had carried on anyway. He didn't speak for a while, letting the sound of birds and the soft wind fill the space. Lena took a sip of her tea, watching him. Finally, she said, "Your husband. He was a good man, brave, kind, and fair. He believed people should be judged by their hearts, not their skin. That's what I loved about him. That's what I still remember every day." Bradley felt a lump in his throat. I didn't know," he admitted. "I didn't know who he was. I don't know what I thought." "You didn't know," she said softly. "And now you do." That's the start. They sat in silence for a while. Then Lena began telling stories about her husband, about how he would spend hours helping young soldiers learn to read maps, about how he would insist everyone eat together regardless of rank, about the way he would walk into a camp and somehow make every soldier feel seen. Bradley listened, fascinated. He realized that the man he had dismissed as just another officer in the military was someone extraordinary. She told him about the day her husband had been wounded during a mission. She spoke of the fear, the waiting, and finally the relief when the news came that he had survived. Bradley could hear the emotion in her voice. He imagined her sitting in that hospital room, clutching his hand, praying he would make it. And then she told him about the day her husband had saved his men, including Bradley's father. Bradley's heart pounded as he listened. He had heard bits of the story from his father, but hearing it from Lena made it real, vivid and raw. He pictured his father, young and frightened, being pulled from danger by a man who didn't hesitate, who didn't care about rank or race. Lena looked at him, her eyes steady. "You see," she said, "Daniel believed that courage wasn't just about facing bullets. Courage was about doing what was right even when it was hard. That's the lesson he left me with. That's what I try to live by every day." Bradley nodded, swallowing hard. I don't know how to say it," he said. "I feel ashamed. I was cruel, and I didn't even know it at the time." She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "We all make mistakes," Lena said. "The important thing is what we do after. You're here now, admitting it. That's the first step." He felt a weight lift slightly, though the guilt still lingered. For the first time, he felt the desire to change. Not because someone was watching him, not because of rules or punishments, but because he had been shown the truth about humanity. Over the next hour, they talked quietly on the porch. Lena told him about her life after her husband passed, the loneliness, the quiet mornings, the small joys of tending her garden and visiting the cemetery. Bradley listened, fascinated by her resilience. He realized how much courage it took to live through loss and still carry yourself with dignity. At one point, Bradley glanced at the folded flag on the table. It seemed sacred, a symbol not just of her husband's service but of everything he had believed in. He remembered how he had looked at it the day before with suspicion and disdain. Now he felt a deep respect. "I can't imagine losing someone like that," he said quietly. "Not like that." Lena smiled faintly, a soft, sad smile. "You learn to carry the love with you," she said. "It never really leaves. You just keep it in your heart and let it guide you." Bradley thought about his father, about how he had survived because of Lena's husband. He realized that his father had carried that love, that respect, and that courage with him all those years. And now he had a chance to honor it too. He stayed longer than he planned, listening to Lena share memories, learning about the kind of man her husband was, understanding for the first time what true bravery and compassion meant. She didn't lecture him or demand apologies. She simply shared her story, and in doing so, she began to change him. By the time Bradley left, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. He walked to his car slowly, feeling the heaviness of the day but also a strange lightness as if a part of him had been lifted. Lena waved from the porch, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection they had made. Driving home, Bradley thought about what he had learned. He realized that he had spent years judging people by the wrong things, by appearances, assumptions, and prejudice. He thought about the officers he had worked with, the people he had stopped, the ways he had misused his authority. and he felt a deep desire to make amends, to be better. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about Lena and her husband constantly. He remembered the stories, the quiet strength, the courage in the face of loss. He couldn't ignore it. It had become a part of him now, a lesson he couldn't unlearn. One morning, he returned to Lena's house, this time without a ticket, without a uniform. He wanted to speak to her, to learn more, to begin understanding the life her husband had led and the legacy he had left behind. Lena greeted him quietly as if she had been expecting him. There was no judgment, no anger, just a soft understanding. They spent hours talking again. Lena shared more stories of her husband's life, the missions he had led, the soldiers he had protected, and the small acts of kindness he had performed that had gone unnoticed by the world. Bradley listened, taking it all in, feeling a growing respect and admiration. She told him about the sacrifices Daniel had made, the risks he had taken, the nights he had lain awake worrying about the safety of his men. Bradley realized that true heroism wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard, even when no one was watching. Bradley felt a change within himself. He wanted to be better, to act with integrity, to see people as they truly were, not as he assumed they were. He began to understand the depth of prejudice and the harm it caused, and he vowed silently that he would never repeat the mistakes he had made with Lena. By the end of the afternoon, Lena stood at the door watching Bradley leave. She didn't know if he would change, but she hoped he would. And Bradley, driving away, felt a new sense of purpose. He knew that the encounter with Lena and her husband's legacy had altered his path forever. For the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe there was a way to make things right, to honor those who had come before him, and to live with the courage and integrity that Major Daniel Cooper had shown. As Bradley drove down the highway, he thought about the road ahead. Not just the physical one, but the journey of his life. He realized that some lessons come in unexpected ways, sometimes from the most ordinary moments and sometimes from the people we least expect. Lena had shown him that. Her strength, her dignity, and her love for her husband had opened his eyes in a way nothing else could. That evening, Bradley returned home, his mind filled with memories, stories, and the quiet power of someone who had lived a life of courage. He sat in his living room, staring at a photograph of his father, remembering the stories he had been told and connecting the dots. He understood now more deeply than ever the impact one life could have on many others. And so, the first real step in his journey of change had begun, sparked by a chance encounter on a quiet highway with a woman who had faced loss and prejudice yet remained unbroken, a woman who carried the lessons of her husband and now, unknowingly, was passing them on to him. Bradley couldn't stop thinking about Lena and her husband. Every night as he lay in bed, he replayed the moments on her porch, the quiet dignity in her eyes, the stories of her husband's bravery. It was a heavy weight, but one that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt before. He realized that his life up to that point had been narrow, focused on rules, authority, and appearances. Now he saw how much he had been missing. The next morning, Bradley decided he had to do more than just apologize. He wanted to understand. He wanted to see the world through a different lens, a lens that Lena and her husband had shown him. He dressed quietly, avoiding his uniform, and drove to the small house at the edge of town. Lena opened the door before he could knock. She didn't smile, but there was a softness in her expression, an openness. She gestured for him to come inside. Bradley followed, feeling nervous. He didn't know exactly what he would say or ask, but he knew he needed to start somewhere. They sat again in the small living room, the afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Lena poured tea just as she had before, and they spoke in quiet, careful tones. Bradley asked questions about her husband, about the missions he had led, about the men he had saved. Lena answered patiently, her voice steady, even when she recalled painful memories. She told him about the day her husband had been deployed to a dangerous area overseas. The letters she received were few and often delayed, but everyone carried hope and concern. She remembered the nights she stayed awake, listening for the phone to ring, praying for his safe return. Bradley listened, imagining her fear, imagining her loneliness. He had never thought about the families behind the uniforms, about the lives that waited anxiously while someone else risked theirs. Bradley asked about the men Daniel had saved, trying to understand the magnitude of his actions. Lena spoke of courage not as a heroic word, but as simple choices. Choosing to stay when it was easier to run, choosing to help someone in need even when it was risky, choosing to act with honor even when no one would see. She described her husband as a man who believed in fairness and humanity above all else, someone who judged people by their hearts, not by their skin. As she spoke, Bradley felt a shift inside him. He had spent years judging people too quickly, letting assumptions guide him. Now he realized how dangerous and small-minded that had been. He could feel the prejudice he had carried, almost as if it was a heavy coat he had worn for decades. And now, Lena's words were helping him take it off. For the first time, Bradley began to see the difference between authority and true courage. His uniform had once been a symbol of power. Now he understood that true power came from humility, compassion, and justice. He felt ashamed of the way he had treated Lena, of the assumptions he had made, of the arrogance that had guided his actions. Lena paused for a moment and looked at him. "Bradley," she said, "do you understand now what your father's life owed to my husband?" Bradley nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "I do." She reached out and touched his hand lightly. It was a gesture of forgiveness, of understanding, and it struck him deeply. He realized that she wasn't just forgiving him for his mistake with her. She was showing him a path forward, a way to be better, a way to carry the lessons of her husband into his own life. Over the next few weeks, Bradley returned to Lena's home often. Sometimes he came with questions, sometimes just to listen. Lena shared stories of her husband's life, his kindness, his bravery, and his quiet acts of heroism. Bradley listened, taking notes in his mind, letting each story sink in. He began to see the world differently, noticing the small ways people showed courage every day, ways he had ignored before. One afternoon, Lena invited him to the cemetery where her husband was buried. Bradley felt nervous as they walked together along the quiet paths. The headstones rose quietly, each one marking a life lived and a story untold. When they reached Daniel's grave, Lena knelt and placed fresh flowers at the base. Bradley watched her, feeling the weight of the moment. She spoke softly, telling her husband about the day Bradley had come to apologize, about the conversations they had shared, and about how she hoped that others could learn from his life as she had. Bradley stood quietly behind her, feeling small and yet profoundly moved. After a few minutes, Lena turned to him. "Bradley," she said, "your life can be better if you choose to carry these lessons forward. The courage and fairness that Daniel lived by don't have to stay in the past. You can bring them into your own life." Bradley nodded, feeling tears sting his eyes. "I will," he said. "I promise." From that day forward, Bradley's perspective began to change, not just in his interactions with Lena, but in his daily work. He treated people with more care, listened more than he spoke, and made an effort to act with fairness. He noticed small injustices he had ignored before and took action, even when it wasn't easy. He began sharing the stories of Daniel Cooper with his colleagues, not as lessons of judgment, but as examples of what true courage and integrity looked like. Some officers scoffed, some ignored him, but a few listened, and slowly a small ripple of change began to form. Bradley also began visiting Lena more frequently, helping her with errands and household chores. They would sit together on the porch, sharing stories and memories. She spoke of her husband's philosophy, that every person deserved dignity and respect, that kindness was stronger than hate, that courage was shown not in words, but in actions. Bradley carried those words with him, letting them guide his decisions. One afternoon, Lena told Bradley a story about her husband's final mission. He had been assigned to lead a unit through a dangerous area. They were outnumbered and under constant threat. Yet Daniel had focused not on fear but on protecting his men. He had risked his own life repeatedly to ensure everyone got home safely. Bradley listened, awed by the depth of sacrifice. Lena paused, looking at Bradley with a quiet intensity. "That is the kind of man Daniel was," she said. "He believed in doing what was right even when it was hard. He believed that every life mattered. And I hope," she added, "that you can carry a piece of that with you." Bradley nodded, feeling a deep sense of responsibility. He realized that change wasn't just about personal growth. It was about creating a ripple that could touch others. He thought about the people he had wronged, the assumptions he had made, the times he had failed to act with justice. Now he wanted to do better. Over time, Bradley began volunteering in the community, helping young people, assisting elderly neighbors, and speaking out against unfair practices. He shared the lessons he had learned from Lena and her husband, hoping to inspire others as he had been inspired. Lena watched quietly, proud of the man he was becoming. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need thanks. She simply wanted the lessons of her husband's life to continue, to reach those who needed them most. Bradley became a living example of that, carrying the values of courage, kindness, and fairness into his own life. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Bradley turned to Lena. "I never imagined that a simple traffic stop could change my life," he said. "But meeting you, learning about your husband, it's been the most important lesson I've ever had." Lena smiled softly. "Life has a way of teaching us," she said, "sometimes in the most unexpected ways. What matters is that we learn." Bradley nodded, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He realized that true understanding came not from authority or power, but from listening, learning, and carrying forward the lessons of those who had come before. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Bradley felt a quiet resolve. He would honor Daniel Cooper's legacy not just in words but in actions. He would live with integrity, treat people with respect, and strive to be a man of courage and fairness. And so, in the small town where a chance encounter had begun a journey of reflection and change, Bradley took the first real steps toward becoming a better man. He had been shown the power of humility, the strength of forgiveness, and the enduring impact of one person's life on another. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges and moments that would test him, but for the first time Bradley felt ready to face it, guided by the quiet strength of a woman who had lost so much and the enduring legacy of her husband, a man who had lived with courage and honor every single day. As the night settled in, Bradley walked back to his car, the cool air filling his lungs. He looked up at the stars, thinking of Daniel Cooper, thinking of Lena, thinking of the man he wanted to become. And with that thought, he started the engine, ready to carry the lessons he had learned into every part of his life, determined to make sure that justice, compassion, and courage would guide him from now on. After weeks of visiting Lena and listening to her stories, Bradley felt a deep shift inside himself. Every encounter made him question the way he had lived, the way he had judged people, the way he had let assumptions guide his actions. He began to notice things in his daily life that he had ignored for years, the quick judgments, the small injustices, the moments when he had chosen convenience over fairness. One morning, Bradley arrived at the police station and realized he could no longer ignore what he had learned. He started small, correcting a colleague who had made a sarcastic comment about a man from the neighborhood. His tone was firm, but calm, and it surprised both the officer and himself. Over the next few days, he found himself speaking up more, noticing biases, pointing out unfair treatment, and listening instead of reacting. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but it was different now. It was purposeful, not fearful. Even outside work, Bradley's life began to change. He spent more time volunteering in the community, helping at the local youth center, and visiting elderly residents who lived alone. He shared stories of courage and integrity, not as lectures, but as examples of how one person could make a difference. People began to notice the change in him. Some were skeptical, some were surprised, but slowly a sense of trust began to grow. Bradley continued visiting Lena regularly. Each time he learned something new, not just about her husband, but about life, resilience, and the quiet ways people showed bravery every day. One afternoon, Lena invited him to help with her garden. She had always loved tending the flowers, but as her hands aged, some tasks became difficult. Bradley worked alongside her, planting, weeding, and watering. They spoke quietly as they worked, laughter occasionally breaking the calm. It was during these moments that Bradley began to understand the depth of Lena's strength. She had endured so much, losing her husband, facing prejudice, navigating a world that was often unkind. And yet she remained compassionate. Her life was a testament to the quiet courage that went unnoticed by most, and Bradley realized that he had been blind to such courage in the past. One day, as they sat on the porch after a morning of gardening, Lena spoke about her husband's belief in fairness. He always said, she said, that respect and kindness cost nothing, but they could change everything. Bradley listened intently, realizing how much he had taken for granted the power of simple acts. Inspired by what he had learned, Bradley began thinking about ways to honor Lena's husband and share his story with the town. He started writing a proposal to the police department, asking for a recognition of Major Daniel Cooper's service. He described the heroism, the integrity, and the sacrifices he had made. He emphasized the importance of honoring those who not only served their country, but also showed humanity to everyone around them. Submitting the proposal was nerve-wracking. Bradley knew that some of his colleagues might dismiss it, but he felt compelled to act. The following days were tense, filled with uncertainty, but he reminded himself of Lena's words about courage and doing what was right, even when it was hard. Meanwhile, Bradley continued to spend time with Lena, helping her with errands, listening to her memories, and learning from her quiet wisdom. He began to see the world differently, noticing the small acts of kindness, the struggles of ordinary people, and the ways in which injustice could quietly harm a community. He carried these observations with him into his work, trying to act with fairness and compassion in every situation. One afternoon, Lena shared a story about her husband that struck Bradley deeply. Daniel had once intervened during a conflict between soldiers of different backgrounds, teaching them that respect and understanding were more important than anger and prejudice. He had believed that everyone deserved a chance to be heard, and he had acted to make sure that justice and fairness prevailed. Bradley realized that he had been given a chance to learn the same lesson, and he vowed to carry it forward. Over time, Bradley's actions began to have an impact on the community. People noticed the changes in him: the patience, the fairness, the willingness to listen. Some began to approach him with their concerns, trusting that he would act with integrity. Bradley felt a sense of responsibility that he had never experienced before, understanding that true courage was not about authority but about the choices one made every day. One evening, Lena invited Bradley to accompany her to the cemetery once more. They walked together quietly, the sky painted with the soft colors of sunset. Lena placed flowers on her husband's grave, speaking softly as if he could hear her. Bradley stood nearby, reflecting on the lessons he had learned and the journey he had begun. After a few minutes, Lena turned to him. "You've learned well," she said, "not just about Daniel, but about life." Bradley felt a lump in his throat. He realized that her words were not just praise. They were a reminder of the responsibility he now carried. The lessons of integrity, fairness, and courage were not his alone. They were meant to be shared. In the following weeks, Bradley continued his efforts to honor Daniel's legacy. He organized community events, sharing stories of bravery, fairness, and resilience. He spoke to young people, encouraging them to act with integrity and respect. He worked to address small injustices, making changes wherever he could. The impact was gradual but meaningful, as people began to see the value of fairness and the power of small acts of courage. Bradley also spent time reflecting on his own life, acknowledging the mistakes he had made and the ways he had allowed prejudice to guide his actions. He began to take steps to make amends, apologizing to those he had wronged and striving to act with compassion in every encounter. Lena's guidance and her husband's example became a constant source of inspiration, reminding him that change was possible, no matter how ingrained old habits might be. One afternoon, Bradley and Lena were sitting on the porch when a neighbor came by to thank Lena for helping with a local charity event. Bradley watched as Lena spoke kindly, her humility and warmth evident in every word. He realized that true influence was not about authority or recognition, but about the quiet ways people made a difference in the lives of others. He felt grateful for the lessons he had received and determined to continue learning and growing. As the days passed, Bradley began to feel a sense of peace he had never known. He understood that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about making better choices in the present and future. Lena's strength, her husband's legacy, and his own growing awareness combined to create a new path for him, one guided by integrity, courage, and compassion. He also realized that forgiveness was a powerful force. Lena had forgiven him without demanding it, simply by showing patience, understanding, and grace. That forgiveness allowed him to confront his own failings and strive to be better. Bradley knew that he would carry that lesson with him forever, letting it guide his actions in every aspect of his life. One evening, as Bradley was leaving Lena's home after helping her with groceries, he paused and looked at the small blue house, the white picket fence, and the tall oak trees. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the chance encounter on the highway, the lessons he had learned, and the responsibility he now carried. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and determination. He got into his car and drove slowly down the quiet road, thinking about the people he could help, the injustices he could address, and the ways he could honor the legacy of Major Daniel Cooper. Bradley understood that true courage was ongoing, a choice made every day through actions, decisions, and the way one treated others. Over the next few months, Bradley continued to work closely with Lena. He helped her with household chores, attended community events with her, and spent time listening to her memories. Each interaction strengthened his understanding of integrity, fairness, and compassion. He became a better officer, a better neighbor, and a better man, guided by the example set by Lena's husband and the quiet strength of Lena herself. Bradley also began sharing Daniel Cooper's story with others in the police department, hoping to inspire his colleagues to act with fairness and courage. Some were resistant at first, but others listened, and slowly, the values he shared began to influence the culture of the department. Bradley realized that one person could create change, and that change could ripple outward to touch many lives. One afternoon, Lena told Bradley about a letter her husband had written before his final mission. In it, he spoke about courage, kindness, and the importance of judging people by their actions, not their appearance. Bradley read the letter carefully, feeling the weight of its message. He realized that the lessons it contained were not just about Daniel's life, but about how he could live his own life going forward. Bradley left Lena's house that day feeling more determined than ever. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he also knew that he had the guidance, the inspiration, and the courage to continue. Lena had shown him what it meant to live with dignity and compassion, and he was determined to honor that in everything he did. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the quiet town, Bradley drove home with a renewed sense of purpose. He reflected on the journey so far, on the lessons he had learned, and on the path that lay ahead. He understood that true change required effort, humility, and courage, and he was ready to face